This is the story of my father and our family during World War II. He was an academic chemist who served in active federal service with the Maine National Guard for 4.5 years. As a field artillery officer and battalion commander, he was overseas in the Pacific Theater for 3 years, was twice wounded and much decorated. He wrote letters home profusely, a sample of which I read in this narration. He died by his own hand shortly after returning home in 1945. He was 45 years old. This is also my mother's story. She was a writer and pianist who took the family to New York City to pursue her multiple careers while my father was away. She carried on, holding the family together despite challenging personal issues. After the war, she remarried and later became a Third-Order Franciscan. She died of natural causes in 1986 at age 80. In this drama, she shares the stage fully with my father and is, in the end, the stronger of the two. I dedicate this with love to my 3 sisters, Valerie, Abby, and Dale Ann.
My father died in 1945. He was in the Army in World War II. My mother is 79 now, and she is still alive and living in Florida. On my 50th birthday, I happened across some letters he wrote from in the basement of my house, letters my father had written from the South Pacific. I knew he had written thousands of letters because I was about 10 when he went in the Army. I searched more of these letters out, and I found them all over the country. I found them in a farm in Virginia, in a condo in Florida, in a journalist's house in Maryland, a chemical engineer's house in Indiana. I became absolutely fascinated with the story that he wrote about. I interviewed people that served with him. I searched out documents in the archives. I visited places that he had been. In 1983, I went through Japan, the Philippines, and the Solomon Islands, and in New Zealand in 1984. This is the story. I'm going to try to tell you the story through his letters, but with some intervening information as I have learned them. You will see photos which were taken by me on my visits that were given me by other participants, photos that came from the Army Signal Corps files. I will not try to explain each photo in detail, but I think you can safely assume that the photos are either of the very same places I'm talking about or of the same people and the same time, either 1983 when I was there or 1943 when he was there. Very often it's all three. My father, Wilber Bradt, was born in 1900 in Indiana. Here you see him with his mother and his grandmother. Within a year they moved to a farm in Versailles, Indiana, within a year of his birth. And his father, while they lived there in the next 10 or 15 years, was away teaching much of the time, then off in Europe with the Salvation Army in World War I. Wilber, my father, was the oldest of the 5 children and in a sense had to carry a lot of the responsibility for that farm and that family. When in 1944, when I was in a boarding school, a farm boarding school, and completely new to farming, he recalled in one of his letters some of his boyhood experiences from those days. In a letter to my sister Valerie, who was 13 then, he wrote, "For some reason on my walk, I was reminded of some flowers I had when I was 8. I spent about a month plowing a large field, one end of which was near a woods. At that end, violets grew wild. I couldn't plow them under, so whenever I came to a bunch, would dig them up and transplant them to where I had already plowed. Probably Father wondered why I didn't get more plowing done, for I'm sure too much of the time was wasted on the violets. All summer I harrowed and disked and rolled that field and carefully went around my patch of violets. They were the biggest and prettiest violets I ever saw growing wild. I used to think they appreciated not being plowed under. Another incident he recalled in 1944, looking back to his boyhood. During one cold winter, I had to cut a hole in the ice on a pond every evening, then drive the cows down there. When it was really cold, they wouldn't want to go and would break back into the barn. Sometimes the ice would be back over the pool before I could get the cows down there, and I would need to start over again. One day I was very disgusted with cows, so I put some extra salt in their feed. The next night I went down to the pond and cut the ice, and then back to the barn to open the door of the cow stable. When I opened it, the stable seemed to explode cows. They knocked me down and jumped over me and dashed for water. I'll never forget how surprised I was when they came out of the stable that evening. When he was 18 years old, he joined the Student Army Training Corps toward the end of World War I. This was at the University of Indiana, and there he was in this for something less than a year and never went overseas, only trained and caught pneumonia. His mother, he had a very proud mother, as you can see from this photograph. After the war, he continued with the National Guard. He joined the National Guard in the 1920s and trained with them regularly on their weekend drills and on their summer training. He graduated from the University of Indiana in 1922 with a chemistry degree, went on to graduate school, and while in graduate school was commissioned in the artillery. He earned a PhD in chemistry in 1926 and went off to Washington State College, his first job in the chemistry department there. In June 1927, he met Norma Sparlin, a pianist, writer, an active, alive student. Later in the war, he often remembered a memorable picnic. He wrote of it on July 4th, 1943, as he was about to enter combat for the first time. I remember, too, that it was a July 4th in 1927 when I took Nana out on a picnic above the Snake River Canyon. We walked a path together over the river, and the flowers were lovely and the air was fresh and cool. Later it rained and we sat under a blanket and talked. On the way home, Norma sat on my lap and I wished we might never get home. It was one of the perfect days of my life. We are moving now into the beach, so I must stop again. They were engaged and married in August of that year. He gave her this photo of himself for her wedding book. They honeymooned in the Canadian Rockies, a hectic trip with visits to relatives that took them finally to his first job at the University of Cincinnati. His wife, my mother, studied piano in Cincinnati Conservatory. The following year, he earned an appointment as assistant professor back in Washington State, where he'd had his first job and met my mother. There, I was born in 1930, followed by Valerie in 1932. These years, there were lots of outdoor picnics, geology outings, and National Guard drill and training camps. He made many close friends in the National Guard in Washington State, some of whom we'll hear of later. In 1936, another chemistry job as head of the department at the University of Maine. So we moved all the way across the country. And there he again joined the National Guard. Val and I had grown a bit, as had my father. Mother was active in music circles, recitals, teaching at the University of Maine one semester, and she finished and never published a novel called Grand Coulee. In February 41, the European war is in progress. The previous May, Paris had fallen. and his National Guard unit was called to active duty. He wanted to go. He'd been training 20 years with the National Guard. However, his weight was excessive, his age was old for his relatively low rank. He was 40 and only a captain. But he lost 40 pounds in a month or two and went off with the 43rd Division, the New England National Guard, to training camps in Florida and Mississippi. This was a full 9 months before Pearl Harbor. My mother, unlike many service wives, did not choose to stay in the hometown with all the faculty friends and Army families that were there in Bangor, Maine. She decided to push her career, and we moved to Manhattan, Mother, Valerie, and myself. And there she studied piano with the renowned pianist Gabi Casadesus. I was put in a church school, Grace Church Choir School, and I remember the war was real in New York City. I remember dim lights so ships would not be silhouetted in the lights because they were being sunk off the eastern coast off the coast by German subs in those days. I remember my mother suspected upstairs neighbors were German spies. And it's very possible that's true, though I haven't documented it yet. My father's letters show the concern of concern for the safety of all of us because of these activities of hers. My father did come home on leave to New York City to visit us several times in the 1.5 years he was in the country. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese fleet sailed from Japan in a daring and imaginative raid on Pearl Harbor, often called treacherous by the Americans. It was as it was from the American point of view. When it happened, my father knew it was a dramatic time. We had been heading for it for a long time. He's already in the service, and he'd been training since 1918. So he wrote this rather melodramatic account as he heard the broadcast that very afternoon. Dearest wife and my darling children, I am just hearing newscasts of Japan's attacks on Hawaii and Manila. I have expected war to come to us for a long time. It is here, and I want you to know I love you. That seems to be all there is in my heart. This may and probably will mean all leaves cancel. If so, I am content until I can come back to you to stay. The American people have given us a lot better chance to train than the soldiers of the last war. We are approaching a state of being well equipped. I am not worried. Beloved, do not be afraid. This time of trial can only hurt you if you are afraid. Bad times are ahead, but we will come through them together. I am counting on you to be my reserves. Goodbye now. So sorry, will say Japan. He will be sorry too. Wilber. The Japanese invaded the Philippine Islands within days and captured Manila. MacArthur had declared it an open city so it would not be damaged by fightings. The Americans and Filipinos withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula, which you can see here on the left. After 4 months, the Americans surrendered, and as they marched up northward to their prison camps, many died and were killed, and this is the famous Bataan Death March. Corregidor, the little island that guarded the harbor entrance, held out for 1 more month. It was bombarded day and night for that month. MacArthur's headquarters were in this tunnel, Malinta Tunnel. And finally, in May 42, Corregidor itself surrendered after MacArthur had escaped to Australia so he could lead the rest of the war effort in the Pacific. It would be 2.5 years before the Americans returned. Corregidor today is a living memorial, unlike many others in any other part of the world that I've seen. There are so many damaged buildings still there. Here you see a naval gun, good for protecting the harbor from oncoming ships, but no good for protecting the island itself. And here's a close-up view that shows you the many shell marks. Here the theater, the base theater, it was a formal army base, and here's the remnants of the movie theater. And finally, the memorial to the soldiers that died there. Well, the Japanese went rushing through the Pacific. They were through Singapore and down through New Guinea and into the Solomons before 6 months were out. The Solomons, they started building an airport, which later became known as Henderson Field, and it was such a, as you can see from the map here, the Solomon Islands, an airfield there in effect came close to cutting off shipping to Australia from the United States. It was a very critical thing, and the Americans put Marines on that island, recaptured the field instantly, and for the next 4 months the Marines were defending that field from Japanese attacks. The Americans were reinforcing and the Japanese were reinforcing, and that went on for 4 months till finally the Americans held it. During these famous battles, but just as they got started, when the Marines first arrived there, they were in a very tenuous position. It was so clear the Japanese could knock them off that the Navy, and there were so few troops down there, that the Navy Department convinced the Army that they needed at least one more division out there, and the 43rd Division was called up out of the camp in Mississippi and sent out there. They never helped defend Guadalcanal, but they were sent out there because of the crisis in Guadalcanal. Thereafter, as you see on this map, they had 11 voyages for the next 3 years and 1 week. It was a tour par excellence. They went to New Zealand, and then they went up to the Solomons, and they were in the Solomons for a full year, and then back to New Zealand, back south to New Zealand a year at the end of the year for more training, and up to New Guinea, and then finally in 1945 up to the big landings when the Americans re-entered the Philippines, and then finally the occupation of Japan, and then after only 2 weeks they were shipped back to the United States after 3 years and 1 week. His letters, as he was preparing to leave in 1942, were very melodramatic. He wrote a series of very short letters to relatives and friends because going overseas across that big ocean was a little scary. There were submarines and the like. He wrote, "Son, I am proud to have a boy like you to go to war for." He wrote this to me. "I know you will do all you can to keep the home fires burning until I come back. Excuse me. I'm sorry to be away from you now, but I would be sorrier, and so would you, if I were trying to keep from fighting for my country. When you study history, you will notice that there are good times and bad times for people. Anyone who lives very long sees some of both. It isn't really so important how good or bad times are. It is really important if people are afraid or not to worship God and are afraid to have the right to talk freely and to be given a trial before being punished. If people are afraid like the French were, things will be really bad, but if they aren't afraid to fight as the Greeks did, things will be okay again. One of my best friends is a Greek." While he was traveling overseas, that long voyage that lasted about 3 weeks on the way to New Zealand, he wrote to my mother, "I remembered a night in a church in Portland, Oregon, where a lovely young bride named Norma heard the pastor say, 'Kiss the girl, lad.' Such a good beginning. All the later nights that Nana was kissed and hugged and mussed and gumbled are as precious to me. Your spiritual beauty has led me while your physical charms have enslaved me. You have the gift of completely satisfying my hunger in the most interesting ways. Darling, never fear but that the joy of your body will keep me from any other woman. You are my V girl." That was V for victory. It might have had sexual connotations. I'm not sure. "And with the end of this war, I will reclaim you and hope you will not have forgotten your wiles. I send you my caresses. I hold you in my arms. My dark body presses against your white skin. My lips are on your breasts. I am your lover. Please do not worry about my returning unchanged. I will come back to my own, my beloved Nana." They went on up to New Caledonia, I didn't mention that. There was a defense. They sat there for 2 months in a defensive posture in case the Japanese tried to come further south. And he wrote a short note to my sister about the river and the mountains that were near them. This is to Valerie in January of '43. There are clouds hanging around their top right now, and the air is soft as it is before a rain. It probably is raining on the other side of the mountains now. These mountains are different from others because they can move. At least a lot of people say the mountains are coming closer, when they are pretty disgusted with not being home. Whenever anyone complains about anything, the rest of us all sing, "The mountains are getting closer to him." It sounds silly, but it's fun. The same letter to Valerie continues. There are lots of ants here, and they have a highway, I think it is US 2, right past one leg of my cot. About 1 out of every 20 ants runs up my cot leg to see how I am. If I have killed any mosquitoes, they grab the corpse and rush excitedly down the highway and yell, "Food, food!" All the others on the road yell, "Pass on the word, food on Brat's bunk." Then they all start up the cot leg marching 8 abreast, singing, "Happy days are here again," and "Beer, beer, beer for the privates." When they get up on top, they look around and run along the sides of the canvas. They don't like to walk on a blanket, so they stay on the sides where the canvas of my roll is folded back. Pretty soon the situation looks like this. They catch a few more ants and look and look. Finally, one first sergeant says, "Hey, you back there, go out and see how tough he is." The buck private says, "Who, me? No siree. I's just going by. My captain sent me for some sugar." Off he goes. But some braver ant is sent out and he takes a bite out of my leg. I swat him and another one tries it. I swat him. Some ants go down the leg of the cot muttering about some groceries the wife wanted. Another 1 or 2 take a hunk of me, out of me, and I swat them. Some more ants go down all 6 cot legs talking about how late it is and when does the meat market close, and besides the queen prefers hamburger. After a while the cot looks like this and I feel like this. At about this time he wrote, about the time he wrote this in January 1943, about 2 years after he first went off in the Army, my mother became pregnant by a close family friend, a divorced newspaperman. She did not tell Dad, nor Valerie and me, and led to all appearances her normal life, taking care of us and studying piano. Neither did she tell anyone in her family, including a close sister. She had been writing to Dad continuously, sending him material he asked for, and continued her role as the dutiful wartime wife. After about 2 months on New Caledonia, the 43rd Division moved on to Guadalcanal, that famous island where the fighting had been going on, but now the Japanese were just evacuating it. The Japanese detected the troop ships that they were on and sent a flight of torpedo bombers to attack it and try to sink it. He wrote to Valerie and me about that. The attack on our convoy on the way up here was one of the prettiest sights I have seen. There were Jap flares in the air to help their planes find us. The moon was calmly watching the whole fight, and its light danced on the wave just like in Maine. The planes would come scooting in toward us from the dark, and then the tracer bullets would start reaching out from the ships. When they hit the plane, a little fire would start to spread, and maybe the plane would begin to go crooked. One big gun hit one plane right square in the middle before the pilot dropped his torpedoes at the ship. The shell burst in the plane, and so did his torpedo. There was a great flash and thunderous report, and that plane was completely gone. All this time the ships were zigzagging calmly, just as if they were on a drill. Some torpedoes went close to those ships, one close to mine, but all missed and exploded away from us. Your pop went down behind a steel gun shield a couple of times when things seemed to be coming his way. You know, you can't tame a machine gun by looking it square in the eye. I arrived in Guadalcanal in May 1983, and here is how it looked during my visit. This is the tower built after he was there alongside Henderson Field. I went down to a nearby beach, the beach where the Marines had first landed, and called Red Beach, and here was this gun pointing out to sea, rusted gun, Probably Japanese. A close-up shows you what the sea has done to that gun in the 40 intervening years. But as I found in the Solomons, there were beautiful children. I went up to see a monument on top of a hill. I had to drive over a very grassy, overgrown road and met this guide with a machete in his garden, working his garden, his field. When he learned I was American, he practically adopted me, offered to get in the car and take me there. It seems that every Solomon Islander over 60 years old was a guide for the Americans. I don't know who were guides for the Japanese. When we got to the top of the hill, we saw the U.S. memorial at what's known as Edson's. I believe it's Edson's Ridge, the point where the Japanese almost broke through the Marines to the airfield. It was only a few hundred yards from the airfield. At the other end of the ridge is the Japanese memorial, with a little post at the bottom which indicates there were visitors there even in the last few years. These monuments are not kept up. There are more formal ones down in the town of Honiara, which did not even exist in 1943. There are this group of 4 children in one family. We're near Edson's Ridge, and then I went down to the beach near Henderson Field, and this little boy adopted me, walked all the way down with me, and showed me this wreckage from an old airplane, this landing craft. Look at the trees growing up through it, the sea just behind it, and all this is with a palm. And then as we went down there, we were walking through this palm grove. Palm grove like this, where many, many letters were written, because most of the time overseas they were not fighting; they were sitting in palm groves. Here on Guadalcanal, my father met his old friends from Washington State. He had many times written that they were out in the Pacific, and he hoped to meet them, and here he finally did. It was an awkward, friendly meeting with sort of the underlying emotional aspects hidden. He wrote to my mother, who of course knew them well. These are his old friends from 1930 to 1936 in Washington State. All the old Company E crowd was asking about you, he wrote. They certainly all talked about Norma and what was she doing now and things they remembered. You seemed almost present. All sent their greetings, and even a Lieutenant Patterson who remembered you playing piano. Lieutenant Colonel Morris of Spokane paper asked particularly to be remembered, and Hud and Don seemed definitely to feel you were part of the firm of We, Us, and Company. Chris grinned from ear to ear and says, "How's the missus?" The boys tell me that out of the Company E we knew, over 30 men are now officers. Hud has the same mustache and is only a little more bald. We recalled the nights we sat in Charlie's Place. That was a Chinese restaurant in Pullman, Washington. After drills, they would sit there. And talked to fighting the Japs even back in 1932, and how glad we were to be here now together. Don said when I left, "Are you able to march? Can you march 12 miles in 2 hours and 20 minutes? I answered, "Yes, I did once." They all laughed, and we clapped each other's shoulders, for we had all been there together. I learned later that referred to a fast march they took during maneuvers, and they kidded my father a lot because he was quite heavy, and they figured it was a rough show for him. 5 months later, my dad was to fight side by side with these men, and Chris, and this Chris who grinned from ear to ear, a close family friend, and another officer, French, would be killed. After a few weeks in Guadalcanal, the 43rd Division was shipped on up to the Russell Islands. You see them here in this map, Guadalcanal in the lower right, which now is in U.S. hands. The Russell Islands to the northwest, where the 43rd Division sat for 4 months. The Japanese had built a field further northwest on New Georgia Island, Munda Field. And the Japanese airplanes were traveling southeast down to bomb Guadalcanal. The American airplanes would come up northwest to attack Munda Airfield. And later, the 43rd Division, after a few months, would in fact go up and be one of the prime divisions that would capture Munda Airfield from the Japanese. When they were Sitting on the Russell Islands, you see from the map, they were midway between the Japanese airfield of Munda and the American airfield on Guadalcanal, and they would see planes flying back and forth and occasional dogfights right overhead. He wrote to me, "The planes are going zoom, zoom, zoom overhead. It is morning before breakfast and the air is very quiet and cool. The palm trees are full of birds and coconuts. The birds are waiting to see the sun come up, and the coconuts are waiting for someone to walk under their tree without a helmet. Since they are as high as our house, they land with quite a whomp. One of the planes is just now coming back in a hurry. We always wonder what he saw or did to make him hurry so. Maybe he thinks, gee whiz, I left the coffee on the stove. Or holy smokes, 40 Jap planes, I better go get the boys. Or oh boy, hot cakes for breakfast. Or, I sure ruined that ship. I'll hurry home and tell the skipper and ask for 10 days leave. Or, come on, Jesse, let's go home. Maybe I've got a letter. Anyway, this time he must have come after the boys, for the boys are sure going back up front now."